Good afternoon, folks. Today, I'd like to talk to you about Star Trek Adventures. Specifically, let's take a little bit of a different tack. Rather than me reading out of the book for you and telling you which rules are where, what we're going to do instead is share some of my wisdom and my experience with the game. Something like a troubleshooting or an FAQ. You have something about the game that has gone awry or that you're anxious about, and I hope that this is a compendium of a lot of the frequently overlooked rules and a lot of the first order answers to questions about where things may have gone astray in your game. So, if that's interesting to you, let's dive on into it. I'm the Complex Games Apologist. So, the first question that is going to preoccupy us will be what happens when there's too much of a given pool or too little? Momentum and threat specifically. So, what happens when there's too much threat? What happens when there's too little threat? Or what happens when there's too much momentum? And what does it mean for the game when there's too much or too little of any of these, momentum included? And the answer to this question has a lot to do with the core difficulty of one. In Star Trek Adventures, something that would be actually challenging for one of the protagonists on the television shows that we've watched is the difficulty of one. So there are confounding factors that might make it more difficult that could escalate that. A task could be exceptionally complex, in which case it might have a higher difficulty. But the thing to keep in mind is that a task, the kind of task that isn't an extended task, is something that a character can do in the space of a minute or so. So if it isn't something that you can do in a minute, then perhaps it's either not a task or it could be an extended task. So, how much complexity, how much confounding factors can there be within that small space of the little moment that your character is applying themselves to the job? So, with that in mind, how does that lead to higher and lower amounts of a given pool? Well, I've run the math a couple times, and a character with a decent discipline score and a decent attribute can accomplish a difficulty one task something like 85% of the time. And about half of that time or so, they'll be able to generate a point of momentum, which they might pass on into the group pool. And this means that difficulty one tasks tend to accumulate some amount of momentum for the group. On the flip side, it can be that higher difficulty tasks, especially when they're do or die, when there's something that's pretty important and a character doesn't want to fail at them, they will do the immediate spends to throw stuff back into the pool. And what that means is that threat can grow a great deal if there are not opportunities to build momentum before those high difficulty tasks. Now, you as the game master might be spending that threat on kind of little confounding things that are making stuff difficulty. Showers of sparks might be flying behind the character, and it could be that the ship is rocking back and forth and throwing them off their feet. Could be that another Klingon has beamed down behind them, cutting off their escape route. You could be spending the threat, and that will lead to higher and higher difficulties. It can be a spiral in some respects. And that's one thing to keep in mind when it comes to the base difficulty. Be real with yourself about what was challenging for characters on the show. And sometimes that means you may be setting difficulties a little bit high relative to the character's competence, their basic kind of super Star Trek abilities. Hyper competence is one of the themes of the genre. That's what I mean to say. Likewise, if there's too much momentum in the pool, if the characters are breezing through tasks, if it's always up there at that cap of 6, it may be that there are a lot of difficulty one tasks being invoked in a scene before the scene ends, and there's that little bit of decay that can creep down the momentum count. It can mean that there's a lot of difficulty 0 tasks which are being invoked, and that you as the game master are saying, yeah,
Go ahead and roll for that.
and it may be that those are happening more frequently than really the pace of the genre fits with. And a place to really think about this is that the core rulebook is pretty clear on what a difficulty 0 task is and when to roll for it. Because not everything that is difficulty 0 is necessarily something that you'll get a roll for. So when complications matter, like if you make a grave mistake during the execution of the task, regardless of whether you did it, then that might be an opportunity to roll. The question is, do mistakes matter here? And the other side of the coin is, how well did you do it? So what I mean to say is that there are a number of situations which you might see some effort applied on the show, which may not necessarily have been a difficulty 1 or even a 0 task where dice came out. One of these situations can be the jammed doors, where we know that over time, the idiom of Star Trek adapted to the jammed doorways when the power was offline. And they would often have a magnetic handle that they would grasp onto the door and they would pull it apart. And you would see some effort applied. But the question is there a way to make a real grave mistake in there within the idiom of the show? Is there a way that could be kind of messed up or that could create complications for the character down the line? That's a question to ask yourself when deciding that it's open to rolls of the dice. And the next question is it possible to do this task any better than basic completion? If you're going to open a door and now it's open and you did it, it went from closed to open, then there's not so much space for that to be something which you can do exceptionally well at.
Success.
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 There are some places where how quickly you do it might matter. If you're being chased, and how quickly you open the door might be something that matters. Suffice it to say, this is a place where I've heard tell of people deciding that the game is not for them because they see too much momentum in the pool and they see a lot of rolls occurring, and tasks take time. The decision of how many dice to buy and those sorts of questions is really a place where a lot of session time can get consumed.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it.
Even if these are difficulty 0 tasks and you're saying, all right, well, I'm going to buy an extra die and I'm going to risk that because I think I might be able to get a success within my focus and generate even more momentum from this difficulty 0 task. I'm trying to generate an advantage. I'm going to spend extra momentum and I'm going to get more done and set aside some of that momentum in a way that I might not have been able to otherwise. And that leads us into another kind of ingredient of this, which is that the frequency of how often tasks occur is a partnership between the game master and the players. If there are a lot of difficulty 2, 3, 4, 5 tasks occurring, then that can be a lot of threat occurring. And that may be you as the game master kind of evaluating how hard the thing that the character is doing, maybe a little bit conservatively or harshly. I don't want to use that word, but keep in mind the challenging prompt. That's the thing to keep in mind. It could be that the characters are often doing things that are challenging, that are complex and maybe really difficult, especially in combat, without taking the time to prepare, to use actions to set up and prime the pump for success, to get that momentum to buy the extra dice. That's one ingredient of it, is that it can be a matter of pacing. And this is all about genre, and it's generally about in-character description of what the character wants to do. Because after all, recall, you as the game master are the guy, after hearing the player talk to you about what they want to do. They want to walk over to the science console and they want to search nearby sectors for any sign of a Klingon signature in the ion trails. Perhaps they're going to cross reference the neutral ports of call and look at what ship registries have visited at them. And you say, well, if you want to track down a Klingon ship and know for sure whether there is one or isn't one in a close by sector, that'll be difficulty one. So that's a matter of the character describing and you listening. And we know from the shows that that can be something that people can accomplish pretty simply. You know, they have amazing computers at their disposal. That's something that does fall within that 1 minute mark, honestly. On the other side of the coin, it could be that the players might be narrating really over the top actions that are very difficult without the kind of teamwork that we see so frequently on Star Trek. It can be that the captain calls out, I need an attack pattern, Delta formation, and they, with a direct action on their turn in ship to ship combat, pass on an assist die to the helmsman. The helmsman makes this attack pattern roll, and some momentum is generated. And then Mr. Worf, photon torpedoes full spread, comes booming from the captain's chair. Or perhaps Mr. Worf, with his own initiative, says,
Photon torpedoes ready to fire.
at which point the hand is waved and the photon torpedoes are loosed. This can be a pretty difficult task. It starts out at difficulty 3 after all, and there are some confounding factors which can push it even higher. That's something which can generate a great deal of threat if it's something that the player approaches without those moments of setup. Now, you can imagine things in non-combat world that might be as difficult as throwing out a full volley of photon torpedoes. Because we've seen them on the show, they kind of move in a straight line. It's pretty easy to get out of the way of them. And after all, that's sort of the name of the game for the USS Defiant, is its incredible agility. We see it constantly dodging weapons fire. So we know that this is something which can be difficult. So, if you see too much momentum in the pool, it may be that there's a lot of easy tasks occurring, and that maybe the characters can do some of the things that they're saying they want to try and do without any roll of the dice at all. If you see too little momentum in the pool, it may be that the characters aren't doing much and that they're kind of responding to the situation coming at them, or the characters may not be getting the chance to really prepare themselves for the situation and respond in small incremental steps. Or it might be in rare cases that too many things are difficulty 0 and super easy to do and don't provide that opportunity to grow momentum. Likewise, when it comes to threat, this is one thing where I want to say that it's perfectly okay to be at home with yourself when it comes to having not much threat in the pool. In fact, some very good advice that I've seen from the designers of the game is to keep the threat down at a pretty low level, because it can lead to the characters and the players having some confidence that what they're going to try to do, including risky things, is not going to backfire and blow up in their face the moment that you do it. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that being threat starved is not necessarily a bad thing. If you have some diabolical plans, if there is a hand of fate in this episode, there's some momentous music, or a villain with real agency, then it may be a matter of giving those villains the tasks that allow them to generate additional threat into the pool. Because NPC momentum is one and the same with threat. So what about when there's a lot of threat? What about when the characters are throwing tons and tons and tons of threat your way with immediate spends, with buying extra dice? Well, what can that mean, and how is that remedied? Well, I mean, the first answer to that is to spend it. Propose complications for 2. Just pile them on. It can be sweat beating up on the brow. You can name that as a complication. Someone's getting stressed out, and it can affect the difficulties of later tasks, even, interestingly, to the point of perhaps a droplet being in their eye at an important moment. It can be a matter of uh, having some incidental environmental attacks, things like booby traps, things like a tree limb falling down suddenly and requiring a little bit of evasion and possibly doing some damage. That's the sort of thing that you can spend the threat on. And you can also spend the threat to kind of add additional magnitude to the situation. It can be a matter of the weather turning poorly. Uh, in the middle of a search through the jungle, there's some booming thunder. It's all a matter of the idiom of the episode and kind of trying to keep things congruent with what the players are doing. So if they gave you a lot of threat, it's important, and it is noted in the book that the best way to spend it is on consequences of the risks that they took just now when you got that extra amount of threat. And finally, and in some cases as a last resort, but also an important tool in the game, is the scene reversal. So for 2 threat times the number of characters in the scene, you can call the scene over and set up what the next scene might be. This is a tool that I don't recommend be used very often, and neither does the rule book really suggest that it's something you want to be too eager to do. But notwithstanding that, it's something that's there, and when there's a ton of risks being taken by the characters just to eke out existence to survive, it may be that the really congruent and appropriate thing within the idiom of the genre and the overall structure of your episode, if you want to think of it that way, is to say that they do in fact survive, but not the way they intended. Because after all, that is the nature of risk. So there you have it, folks. That is the first frequently asked question, the most frequently asked question when it comes to troubleshooting Star Trek adventures. It's all about when there are tasks. Listen with your ears and move from there. Think about that core difficulty of 1, and don't forget to spend down your threat pool as the game master and have it all connect to what the characters are doing, because it is, after all, a game about a television show that's about those characters. In a future episode, we'll be looking at the problem of hidden information, the idea of what a spot check, what a search is like in 2.20 system. What does it mean to fail one of those sorts of tasks? And what does it mean to succeed? Well, this is a question that I've seen asked more than a little bit, and I do have a very compact answer for you. But for now, I wish you happy gaming.